Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Could you live without the internet?
I would say no. A very big no.
Well, when you don't have internet, you could actually fall into depression.
We can survive without it, but life will never be the same again.
Difficult to imagine a life without it. And yet this year, several African countries have been affected by internet outages, leaving people without access to the web, messaging services, or social media for hours and sometimes even days on end. The internet has become such an important part of our life that these cuts not only affect the way we communicate, but also the economies of many of our countries. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja, and this is the Next Africa podcast, bringing you one story each week from the continent driving the future of global growth with the context only Bloomberg can provide. This week on the podcast, Bloomberg reporters Ramah Nyang in Nairobi and Loni Prinsloo in Johannesburg are joining me to discuss why Africa, from west to east, has been hit by these recurrent cuts. Later in the program, you'll hear from Loni about the solutions to improve internet access on the continent. But first, let's head to Kenya and get a better understanding of the scale of the problem. So hi, Ramah. Thanks so much for joining us today. And, given the topic, I am glad you were able to connect. Has the connection been okay so far today?
So far, so good. We're back up and running.
That's great. Let's cross our fingers. It sounds like things are better. Ramah, you're in Nairobi. Talk us through how these disruptions have affected your region.
So essentially what happened in very basic terms is that the region as a whole, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, they were all affected by internet cuts in the middle of May. And essentially what had happened is that two of the cables that bring a big chunk of the data traffic along that region had been affected. There was a cable break right off a small coastal town called Mtinzuni off KwaZulu-Natal. And this one little cable break had ripple effects thousands and thousands of kilometers away. In some instances, the US Embassy in Tanzania had to actually stop operating for a couple of days. Here in Kenya, you could instantly realize, oh, wait, hang on a minute, something is really not right here, because your browsing speed just went all the way down. You try to do your mobile banking services and you'd be like, hang on, why am I watching this in 360p or 240p rather than the HD or the 4K that I'm used to? But thankfully now, a couple of weeks later, the cable break has been fixed.
We have to put this into perspective too for people. You said the cable break happened in KwaZulu-Natal, which is here in South Africa where I am. And as you mentioned, had an effect all the way where you are. How significant was this damage? Have they figured out what exactly happened and why it happened?
Not in much detail, not yet. Usually it's two causes that you tend to have when some of these cables eventually do break. I'm going to take you back a little bit towards around the middle of March. The cable breaks that we had on the western side of the continent, big chunk of that was essentially due to seismic activity on the ocean floor. So you've got, the ocean floor moves around, rocks fall on these cables, break them off, then you've got to send people out to fix them. In other instances, it's usually, acts of man, right? So trawler comes in a location where they're not supposed to be. Either they drop the anchor incorrectly or they essentially have these massive trawling nets that come in and they cause damage. If you look at the Red Sea, there's at least 10 different cables that are running in there. You've got a lot of maritime traffic moving up and down. Now combine that with what's happening with the Houthis' attacks on vessels in that area, and it just complicates the matter even further. So usually it's one of those two things: acts of man, acts of God.
Acts of God, which, when we're talking about solutions, is a bit hard to prevent the next time, right? I mean, what are some of the repairs that have gone into these undersea cables right now?
So they sent out a vessel, one of these fairly specialized vessels up from the coast of South Africa. At least thankfully, the voyage in that instance was relatively short. So they go into that location, figure out where the break is. Depending on the equipment that they have, or rather the sort of damage that has been done, then obviously they've got to lay new cable and then connect that into the original cable and repair it in the sections where the break had taken place. In some instances, part of the problem is that the number of vessels available to actually do this sort of work is pretty limited. There's a handful of them, most of them based in South Africa. So the journey to essentially get from point A. You get a vessel out of South Africa, say, for example, it has to move up to the eastern coastline around Mombasa, or it has to go all the way west into around Abidjan. That's a voyage that will take some time. Get there, do the survey, figure out where the cable break is, what sort of repairs are needed. Do we need extra cabling? So in some cases, it can take weeks and millions of dollars just to fix a cable break.
I wonder how you think this sort of speaks to the vulnerabilities of internet access across the continent, because we talk so much about how expanding internet access is important for development, but clearly there are some vulnerabilities that need to be addressed.
Yeah, they are. And to put this into context, at least Kenya was somewhat fortunate in the sense that, at least in this part of the world, we've got at least 6 different fiber optic cables that are terminating in the country. So we don't have the same sort of concentration risk that some other economies would have, which unfortunately is what happened back in March for some countries, out in West Africa that have only one cable connecting them to the wider internet. Is there an argument to be made for expanding investments in having more fiber optic cables coming into the continent? Arguably, yes. And we are seeing some entities already doing that. But by and large, it also comes back down to whether or not governments actually see this as a tool that they need to invest in as a public utility, or if that's something that they're content to just let the private sector take the lead on.
Thanks so much, Ramah. After the break, Loni Prinsloo in Johannesburg will be joining us to discuss the economic impact of these internet disruptions and the solutions possible for the future. Welcome back. Before the break, Ramah Nyang was explaining what happened in East Africa. But there are other regions on the continent that have also been affected by similar internet cuts. Loni Prinsloo is with us. Loni, thanks so much for joining us. So how do you explain this?
There's very limited cables coming to the continent. In our sort of context in Africa, we had 3-4 cables in March break, cutting off most of West Africa. And it's quite difficult to then reroute it because there aren't many cables to reroute this. So the disruption is quite significant, but it still took us to almost end of May, so a few weeks ago, for those cables to be repaired.
Because there was no internet, clients couldn't access the information on their investment, so it affects your credibility.
Banking is technology driven, and technology is based mostly on the availability of internet. They get it. So internet outage means that there is very little the banks can do.
So 1, you don't have access to your clients, either in person and on phone.
Right.
2, you lose lots of money, especially when it's happening for like 20 to 48 hours. It becomes so frustrating. You can lose hundreds and millions of cedis or dollars. Yeah.
And Loni, we just heard there from business owners in Ghana specifically. Are we able to quantify the impact that these disruptions are having on businesses and maybe the economy?
Sure. So the estimates is that the internet industry to Africa adds about $150 to $120 billion to the overall GDP every year. So when the internet cuts daily, you are seeing millions of dollars sort of being cut out of that GDP number. There's an old estimate that said with the banking sector, each hour you lose about $2 million if the internet is cut. So that's each hour, and it's quite an old estimate. So you can see that sort of racks up. The overall impact on the economy is quite significant, and it also takes longer to get the undersea cables repaired compared to other regions because it is quite secluded and there's not a lot of ships servicing the continent.
And Loni, in Europe or America and other developed parts of the world, we don't hear about internet cuts of this scale, maybe for a few minutes, but even that is pretty seldom heard. What's the difference here, and why are African countries so vulnerable when it comes to access to the internet?
When it comes to undersea cables, there's about 574 or so active undersea cables, and only 9 of those are active in Africa to try and connect Africa with data to Europe, data to Asia, data to the US. So you can just imagine every cut that we have is very significant in terms of the problem that arises. It's just really the limited amount of infrastructure that we have that's connecting Africa, which is the largest continent, the fastest growing continent in the world. But we still have the most limited infrastructure when it comes to the internet, and we're the least connected.
So then, Loni, what's the long-term solution here? Are we going to continue to see more private investment, or will we potentially see more government stepping in and putting some of the public finances towards improving the infrastructure?
So you have your big MTNs, you have Seacom, that's also an African company, investing in these cables, Telkom. But you are competing with the rest of the world when it comes to a Google or whoever, even content providers or social media providers like a Facebook, wanting to bring the cables to Africa. Mostly we have lower income users or customers, and we have fewer companies on the continent. So the economics don't always make sense for them to come here. But they still do come. The reason for that mainly is because of sort of geopolitical reasons, wanting to have influence in the fastest growing sort of population, as we said, in the world. And, in time you need that footprint, whether it's from the US or Asia. We saw Google most recently, a week or two ago, and they said they are laying another cable to connect Africa to Australia. Governments really do need to sort of push for this as well. We've seen a recent push, which was interesting for me, Kenyan government.
For the first time in more than 16 years, an African leader is attending the White House for a state visit.
The cherry on top of the cake is President William Ruto's visit to the White House. And from his joint press conference with President Joe Biden, you could get a sense that the U.S. is committed to partnering and working with Kenya, particularly in expanding its digital ecosystem. President William Ruto reiterated that commitment, saying that the country will expanding their investment in things like digital technology to expand access to all Kenyans and tap into that digital economy.
There was also a big promise of a 1 gigawatt data center, which is, almost unfathomable for the region. So governments do need to be active and also invest from their side, but just be active to, approach these sort of more tech giants in the US, in Asia, and see what sort of relationships can be built and what can be sort of agreed upon to try and connect our continent a bit faster.
Thanks so much to Ramah and Loni for joining us today on the podcast. As they were mentioning, we have seen internet penetration across the continent improve dramatically over the past few years, but there is still much more investment that needs to come in order to expand the connectivity and to ensure that these disruptions don't completely set back economies and businesses as they have done in some parts of the continent. So still slightly a ways to go there. This program was produced by Leon Ouedraogo with the help of Tiwa Adebayo, Moses Mozart Zawu, and Echo Donto. The Next Africa podcast is available every week wherever you usually get your podcast. I'm Jennifer Zabasajja. Thank you so much, as always, for listening.